Let's take another deep dive into the Gospel of John. As you can see by the scenery behind me, I'm once again on the road this week as I'm on vacation for a few days in beautiful New Hampshire on a nice sunny day. My hope in these videos, as always, is that they draw you into a deeper engagement and a deeper conversation with John's Gospel. If you haven't had a chance to view the previous videos, this is number 7 in the series. I encourage you to go back and walk through the beginning part of John's Gospel with us in these deeper dive videos. This week we'll be focusing on chapter 11. Now, before we dive into chapter 11, I'd like to take a moment to sort of zoom out and look at John's Gospel as a whole to give us a deeper context for what we'll be looking at specifically this week. Really, throughout John's Gospel, there's a theme that runs throughout. And this theme has sort of 2 points to it. The first point is answering the question, who is Jesus? And the second point of that theme is, do you believe this? We see this throughout the gospel, and specifically, there's these sort of bookends that exist in the gospel itself. So before we look at chapter 11, I'd actually like to go back first and look at chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles, open up to the very beginning of John's gospel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. And this is how John's Gospel begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So in these first 5 verses, John is telling us who Jesus is. He's describing who Jesus is in the opening. And so that's point 1 of this theme that runs throughout, as I said. And then if we read on in the next few verses, we get the second point of this theme where John tells us in verse 6, picking up, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. So John's gospel has this theme of this is who Jesus is. This is a witness to the gospel of Christ. And it constantly offers us and prods us with this question, do you believe this? These things are told so that you might believe. So chapter 1 is sort of providing this opening bookend for the beginning of John's gospel. If we turn all the way to the end to chapter 20, we get the second part of this bookend, this sort of frame for the whole gospel that John gives us. And so in chapter 20, picking up in verse 30, John says this, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So who is Jesus? Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And part 2, do you believe this? These things are written so that you might believe. And so in that context, in this sort of bookend context, if you think about John's gospel like a seesaw or a balance that has a point in the middle, you've got these 2 statements at the very beginning and the very end. And in the middle, you've got this pivot point, and that's where we're going to look today in chapter 11, in sort of the fulcrum, the balance point of these two points. And so one more note on that, there are many scholars who divide John's gospel into 2 actual books themselves. The book of signs, which takes place in chapters 1 through 12. So we'll be right at the end of the book of signs today. And then chapter 13 on through the end through chapter 21 is known as the book of glory. And so it sort of has this symmetrical balance to it. And so with that in mind, with that zoomed out view, we're going to be right dead smack in the middle of that layout. And so that gives a special emphasis to what we'll read today as a main sort of focal point of the entirety of John's gospel. So with that being said, let's look at chapter 11. So once you have your Bibles open to chapter 11, you'll notice that we're looking at the story of the raising of Lazarus. a very detailed account is given to us of this passage, and this is a very famous Bible story. Even folks that weren't raised in the church or people who don't regularly read their Bible are familiar with the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And within this chapter, our focus, we're going to look at 20 verses in particular, right in the middle, verses 17 through 37. And so for a bit of context leading up to 17, Jesus has found out, his disciples have told him that Lazarus is sick and is dying. And Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, have issued a plea, have sent a request for Jesus to come quickly to heal him. Remember I said we're in the book of signs, and the raising of Lazarus is actually the seventh of 7 signs. And the previous 7 signs within them include things like healing the official son, the healing of the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. And as we saw last week, the restoring of sight to the blind man. So there's this progression of healing, this known ability of Jesus to heal people, to make them whole. And so Mary and Martha issue this plea for Jesus to come. Jesus delays going, as we find out in the beginning of chapter 11, and he tells his disciples that this sickness, this will not end, but will proclaim God's glory. Now, there's a couple other little details in here that are very important to note, and that is mainly that Lazarus and Mary and Martha live in Bethany, which we're told is 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And at this point in Jesus' ministry, it is very dangerous for him to enter Jerusalem. The passage just before chapter 11 tells us that the Pharisees there wanted to stone him, and throughout they've been seeking ways to get rid of this problem of Jesus. So being close to Jerusalem, heading towards Jerusalem, is dangerous for him. And Bethany is on the road to Jericho, and it's Passover time. So there's crowds everywhere. There's no way that Jesus can slip in undetected without the Pharisees knowing. And so he goes eventually after delaying, and that's where we pick up in verse 17. So verse 17 through 37 says this. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she replied. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And so from there it goes on to tell the account of how Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Now the interesting thing is, in this sign, in this 7th sign, the previous encounters with Jesus usually resulted in him performing the miracle and then a discourse or a discussion with those present afterwards. In this instance, the discussion happens before the raising of Lazarus. And it's really interesting that the theme and the main point of this is belief and faith, and whether or not, remember, we're identifying who Jesus is, whether or not people have the ability to believe that. And it makes sense that if you're talking about faith, that the sign, the proof of that would follow. The belief has to be there first. You've got to have belief in something without knowing, without evidence, to have faith. And then it is shown to you. So it's really interesting how that happens in the raising of Lazarus. And to draw your attention specifically in this conversation that Jesus has with Martha really encapsulates this kind of two-pronged theme that I've been talking about. And so in verse 25 and 26, Jesus says to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe it?" So Jesus himself, in his own words, highlights, encapsulates, states this two-point sort of theme that he is the resurrection and the life. And he offers this question to Martha, do you believe this? And as we read John's gospel, that's the question we're being asked as well. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Word who was in the beginning. He is the resurrection and the life. And the question for us is, do you believe this? I hope that this deep dive meant something to you. I hope it drew you into a deeper conversation with John's gospel. I invite you to join us on Sunday morning and see where we go from here with this. I'll see you all on Sunday.